Good evening, everybody. This is your host, Aquatic, with the Real Report. Tonight we're going to be covering a plethora of news events from the day, but for this segment, I wanted to specifically cover some things going on in Iraq, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Argentina. Let's hop right on into it. As you guys are familiar, about 2 weeks ago, Sri Lanka had entirely collapsed.
Colombo is in turmoil after protesters stormed the compound of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Security sources say he left the area earlier for his own safety. Public anger at the country's leader has been mounting during the country's unprecedented economic crisis. People are enduring acute shortages of fuel, food, and medicines, with a
So that was about 2 weeks ago. If you guys look at a global shipping route map, there still has been zero humanitarian aid, food shipments, medicine, or fuel entering the country, essentially leaving the residents there to starve to death.
country unable to pay for imports. Critics blame the
As the reporter just said, they're unable to pay for any imports.
hardships on Rajapaksa and his family, who they say are corrupt. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's office says he's willing to resign.
And as we skip through the video here, you guys can find all sorts of footage on Twitter, all over the place. You guys probably already saw this all live. However, I wanted to recover it because it's relevant to the rest of our segment. I'll wrap up skipping through the video here because, so they elected a new, Sri Lanka's parliament elected a new president. He replaced the previous one who was pushed out of the office by protesters, blaming him for the country's economic collapse. And protests are continuing. Anyways, this is on the front steps of their parliament as the protests continue, so there's no sign of that stopping anytime soon. Now, fast forward to today, July 27th, 2022. On Wednesday, hundreds of followers of a militia and political movement overwhelmed security in Baghdad's Green Zone. They were able to breach and storm the country's parliament building, and they come amid political friction. Play the clip. So, as you can see, high-secured Green Zone has, since the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, been home to all major government branches, embassies, diplomatic missions, and international institutions. However, local correspondents have suggested, based on the video to emerge of the protests, that security stood down after being overwhelmed by the crowds. Police were seen milling about the building alongside protesters. Reportedly, no Iraqi lawmakers inside Parliament at the time, with the crowds occupying the building and chanting political slogans. Some more footage on the ground. Country's politics have been gridlocked and essentially grew without government since the October vote. Again, more than 9 months since an October election, lawmakers tasked with choosing a president and prime minister looked no closer to an agreement, bringing Iraq to a record 290 days without a head of state or cabinet. Here we're going to hop on over to Pakistan to Panama, countries which could go the Sri Lanka way. So it looks like Iraq is joining them, and now Pakistan and Panama. It's pretty difficult right now to find any articles on Panama. I'm looking for some footage on the ground, but rumor and grapevine have it that that's going to be the next country to collapse, as it seems to be a growing theme. Sri Lanka is not alone. Rising inflation has pushed a lot of other nations to the brink of an economic collapse. Pakistan and Nepal find themselves with low forex. The soaring cost of living has led to protests in Argentina, Ghana, and Kenya. Sri Lanka's president fled the nation and was forced to resign, which we already knew. The country faces shortages of fuel, medicine, and food, and run out of money to purchase these essentials. Public transport has been hit, ground to a halt. Schools are forced to shut down time and time again. Economic crisis in Sri Lanka has a lot to do with the mismanagement of finances and a whole plethora of other issues. Also dealing with the IMF, wink wink. Chosen Sri Lanka come amid a time of instability across the world. Tiny South Asian nation is not the only one suffering. Several developing underdeveloped nations are on the brink of an economic crisis, with the rising dollar suppressing buying power of many currencies in the international markets and depleting foreign exchange reserves. Taking a look at nations that might just go the Sri Lankan way. Pakistan, not all is well in the neighboring nation of Pakistan. Last week, the country reached an agreement with the IMF to resume its loan programs after repeatedly failing for decades. Nepal, Himalayan nation, is seeing a rise in imports even as forex reserves deplete, and there's a growing imbalance in the balance of payments. Price of essential prices. I don't know why they said that twice. Anyway, food and fuel have risen. Its annual retail inflation accelerated 8.56% in June, the highest in 6 years. Again, that's 8.56% in just June. Pretty much what's happening in the U.S. Top of that, they're also talking about Egypt. Same issue with debt to GDP ratio of 95%. Egypt has experienced one of the largest outflows of foreign funds this year, totaling $11 billion, according to J.P. Morgan. Fast forward down here to Argentina, which gets us into the next couple articles after Panama. Global inflation rising and the fear of recession looming. Argentina's economy is headed for trouble. Also, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Panama. Year-on-year inflation in Panama, 4.2% was recorded in May, along with an unemployment rate of about 10% and fuel price hikes of nearly 50% since January. Also, Albania is experiencing the same problems.
Protesters in Panama burned tires and blocked roads once again in the capital and across the country. In a meeting on Monday morning, a majority of protesters literally tore up the agreement reached with the government late on Sunday to end the blockades in exchange for further reducing the price of petrol.
So I'm not going to play the whole clip, but you get the point that it's being reported in some countries, specifically from Al Jazeera. Pretty sad times when they're covering more news than any Western media. Hopping on over to Reuters before I've already reached my free article limit for the day. Oh well. Analysis out of Argentina. Hasty exit by Argentina's economy minister could deepen market crisis. This is from Buenos Aires. The abrupt departure of Argentina's economy minister and lack of a clear successor could threaten to further destabilize an economy already shaken by sky-high inflation, rising energy costs, and growing fears over possible new defaults on debt. Argentina president urges unity as anti-government protests build. Hear this one, guys. Argentina is grappling with inflation running over 60%. Huge pressure on the peso currency and spiking gas import costs. The capital, Buenos Aires, on Saturday, protesters marched to the gates of the presidential palace, lambasting the government over soaring inflation and crushing national debt. South American country, here you go, guys, cha-ching, cha-ching. Major producer of soy corn is grappling with inflation running at more than 60%. Huge pressure on the peso currency and spiking gas import costs that are draining already weak foreign currency reserves. Bottom line, they are an exporter of goods that we are no longer going to receive. Another one from Reuters. Argentina's economic crisis whack-a-mole goes into overdrive. This one's from the end of June, when they were signaling alarm bells are ringing loudly with fears of Jerome Powell would disagree with this statement, fears of a, quote, global recession and spiraling inflation. That's right, global recession. The Fed could take a note from that. Hopping on over, continuing the food shortage theme, not just the Dutch, farmers everywhere fight for the survival against climate change activism. Dutch government to farmers saying, quote, reduce your operations by up to 95%. Dutch government told farmers to cut ammonia emissions by 50%, and those near protected areas must reduce their operations by as much as 95%, or, hear this, sell their land to the government and face a lifetime ban from farming. Wow, what's that line? You know the line. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Farmer protests taking place across Canada this weekend as well. Protests aiming to bring attention to climate policy proposal in the Netherlands that could produce further harvests and farming income. Now that's from last week because Trudeau just updated that statement. But they were predicting last week and holding protest in solidarity with the Dutch. Protests stem from a proposed climate policy that aims to cut down to 50% nitrogen and ammonia emissions by 2030, which is projected to force at least 30% of farmers out of business. Here out of the Washington Examiner from yesterday, Trudeau fertilizer emission plan sparks backlash from farmers and provinces. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is slated to impose a 30% reduction in fertilizer emissions in the country, sparking intense backlash from farmers and provincial agriculture ministers, who argue the target will decrease crop output, increase prices, and cost farmers billions in lost revenue. The world is looking for Canada to increase production and be a solution to global food shortages. The federal government needs to display that they understand this. The Alberta Minister of Agriculture, Nate Horner, said last week, using some common sense, it seems, which is not so common. Farming is a major sector of the Canadian economy. In 2021, the country exported nearly $82.2 billion in agriculture and food products. Agriculture and agri-food sector accounts for roughly 6.8% of its annual gross domestic product. And with that, we're going to cover U.S. carrier group heading to Taiwan ahead of the potential Pelosi trip. A couple updates on that in the next video, so stay tuned. Have a good night.